In these next few videos, what we're going to do is to try and unpack the employment relationship in slightly more detail, to think about the specifics of how an employment relationship is affected, about what forces govern the way that the employment relationship is set out, and to make sense of particularly bargaining relationships, negotiating relationships within it. So we're going to use a little model here which is very widely used in employment relationship, which sets out forms of behaviour and activity within and around the employment relationship, which give us the opportunity to have some insight into what that employment relationship is like. So we start in this video today thinking about the context of the employment relationship, where it sits, what goes on around it, the forces that affect the potential for what that employment relationship can be. An employment relationship can't just be anything, not even anything that the participants in the relationship want it to be, because it's governed by what is made possible by the context. We're going to go on and think about issues like ideology and particular approaches to bargaining, the forms of interaction between actors in the employment relationship. But we're going to start off today by looking at context. Now, like I said, context is fundamental. Context sets the boundaries for what an employment relationship can be like. Just like any relationship, the quality of that relationship is governed to a greater or lesser degree by the things that go on around it, by the material conditions that a relationship sits within. So we're going to focus particularly on two aspects of that context: the product market context and the labour market context. Now we'll start with the product market context because that's the most important. And when we talk about the possibilities within an employment relationship, how cooperative, how conflictual it might be, the various advantages and disadvantages that accrue to either party within the relationship, all of this is governed principally by the state of product markets. An organisation can't just choose to be generous. It has to be generous on the basis of the resources that it has available to it. And those resources are determined by the state of the product market and by that organisation's position within the product market. So principally, if we're thinking about pay setting decisions, if we're thinking about conditions of employment, if we're thinking about all manner of aspects of the employment relationship, an organisation has to be able to afford those things. And so the state of the product market and where the organisation sits, its success or failures within the product market, they determine the state of what is possible. Now, the nature of product markets, of course, they go up and down, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. But one of the longer term trends that we've seen in product markets over the course of decades has been a process of competitive intensification. If we wind the clock back several decades, we would see an entirely different setup of product markets in which organisations competed. We would see a situation in which organisations largely held the upper hand within product markets in relation to their customers, because they operated either in local markets or in national markets. There were large organisations which often were able to dominate entire markets, and so they could control their own surroundings, their own context to a much greater degree than we see organisations able to do so today. Because since the advent of globalisation, the entrance of new global competitors into product markets, that capacity for any organisation or even any national economy to sort of control its own destiny has fallen away, because we've got the whole context, the whole competitive environment has been blown apart. So, from the 1980s onwards or thereabouts, the entire product market context of organizations and the principal context of the employment relationship has been blasted apart by this growth of really intense competitiveness that we've seen from the growth of new product markets across the globe, and the entrance of new producers, new competitive actors within those product markets. So whereas in the past, in simpler times, there was a fairly clear relationship between employers and employees. They could see themselves as being on opposite sides of the employment relationship, fighting for a greater share of the resources that they were able to guarantee to a certain extent because of the control that they exercised over the product market. It was fairly clear who was on which side and whose interests were which. But there's an argument, there's certainly an argument presented in the 1980s, as this quote here from Bassett suggests, is that growth of competitive intensification, that growth of global product markets changed the kind of orientations within the employment relationship, that it kind of muddied the waters, that actually, rather than it being employers against employees within an organisation, that there was more of a sense of the need for everybody to pull together and to fight these new competitive entrants that were stirring things up in global labour markets, so that the conflicts of the past, the conflict between employer and employees, could be put to one side, band together and fight off the new competitive threat. And certainly that ties in with an awful lot of the sentiment of human resource management during the same period. And this growth of a new competitive environment created a huge amount of change and uncertainty into what employment relations should be like, about what trade unions should do, about how to best represent the interests of their members. A lot of confusion, a lot of doubt about whether a conflictual approach towards employment relations was in the best interests of workers, or whether a new cooperative model in which trade unions effectively ended up working as a kind of friendly society, just offering cheap insurance deals, discount cards, and hopefully waiting for a few scraps from the table to be thrown in terms of pay increases by and large. So we saw this kind of emphasis that the fundamental change in the product market fundamentally changed the nature of employment relationships. Some people arguing that would lead to a more cooperative form of employment relations, but at the same time recognizing that these new, more competitively intense situations generated a greater source of uncertainty and a greater capacity for conflict, because this new competitive environment would lead to a much less certain environment for organizations. Organizations would be much more likely to experience competitive shocks. And when those competitive shocks hit, then the impact upon employment relations could be quite profound and lead to the capacity for greater conflict rather than less. So, fundamental, the nature of the product market. Big shifts in the product market mean big shifts in the employment relationship. Smaller shifts in product market as well have an impact upon the nature of the employment relationship. These are fundamental sources of influence over the nature of an employment relationship, and the key factor of context that we need to understand if we're going to make sense of how an employment relationship functions, and to understand the possibilities within that employment relationship. The other side of context that we're going to think about today are labour markets. And labour markets are sometimes the thing that we think about as being the most important aspect of context, because it's all about supply and demand. And if we're interested in the power relationship, the balance of power between employers and employees, then supply and demand of labour is an important factor in that. It isn't actually as important as product market, but it does have an important influence, and we need to understand the particular dynamics of a labour market or the labour markets that an organisation operates within, because they will have quite a profound effect upon how an employment relationship functions. So labour markets have a direct effect upon the bargaining power of either side within the employment relationship. Labour markets fluctuate. Sometimes they're tight, sometimes they're loose. And what that means is that in a tight labour market, there isn't so much supply of labour. So if an economy is booming, if there's something approaching full employment, everybody who wants a job has a job, then employers start to struggle to find replacements for staff who leave, or to find staff to enable the organisation to expand. Now, when the supply of a commodity tightens, gets more rare, then its value increases. The price that labour, in this instance, can demand for its labour starts to go up. So the tightness or looseness, the state of a labour market, has a direct relationship on the bargaining power of individual employees. When the labour market's tight, it makes an employee stronger in relationship to an employer than they would do in a loose labour market. In a loose labour market, if the economy is contracting, if there's high unemployment, if there's plenty of labour out there for organisations to pick up and get it cheaply, because people are desperate. There aren't many jobs to go around. They just need to work. And so the offer of a job, a wage, at what might have been in other circumstances unattractive rates, suddenly becomes compelling. So understanding the state of the labour market is important. Now, it's not just about how much or how little labour there is available within a labour market that's important, but also how organised that labour is. And this is where unions come into the picture, into their relationship within labour markets. Because if labour within a labour market is disorganised, if anybody is willing to take a job for any amount of money, then that increases the power of the employer. If some group is able to exercise more control over the supply of labour by setting rates of pay across whole industries through collective bargaining or whatever, and to insist and to be able to insist that that those rates of pay are held for all employees, then that increases the power of employees within that labour market and increases the bargaining power of the workers. So the degree of organisation, the strength of unions operating within labour markets, and their capacity to control the supply of labour in that circumstance is a very important contextual feature of an employment relationship within an organisation. Now, obviously, these aspects of labour market changes, the tightness or looseness of labour market, the degree of control of labour market supply, is something that changes cyclically. It changes cyclically in terms of the business cycle. So we will see the economy increasing demand, increasing output, and then we'll see the converse as well as the economy turns to recession or whatever. So we see these relatively short or medium term cycles within the labour market. So we see the strengthening of employer and employee fortunes according to that that business cycle. But we can also see much longer term cycles as well. So John Kelly's talked about the importance of what he calls Kondratiev cycles, much longer run cycles, which bring in the effect of a whole range of different contextual features, which have influence us on bargaining power across a much longer run process. We also see these changes, these cyclical changes in bargaining power reinforced by changes that occur within the product market as well. So one of the things that we've seen in line with the product market changes that we talked about earlier are features like outsourcing, the growth of zero-hours contracts, casualization of work. All of these things are features of changes within the broader product market, but they also kind of key in and reinforce these kind of cyclical changes in the balance of power brought about through labour market changes as well.